Resident Evil Extinction, a novelization by Keith R.A. De Candido. Chapter 7. Before. The face of Dr. Sam Isaacs stared angrily through the computer screen at Dr. Jamie Sirota. She tried not to be intimidated by him, but the way he stared was just demoralizing. It was as if she was in college all over again, with Professor Kropotkin glowering at her in anatomy class. Sweat beaded on her brow, which she was unable to wipe, because she was wearing a hazmat suit. She was still in the containment area for the San Francisco outbreak, in the special tent Umbrella had set up for her upon arrival. How could this have happened, Doctor? Right now, we're a little more focused on containment. Besides, the CDC guys are all looking at me funny. In a tight voice, Isaac said, I'm not interested in how you socialize with the Center for Disease Control, Doctor. I'm interested in how the T-virus has spread to the Mission Hill district of San Francisco. Jamie sighed. As best I can tell, sir, it was Dr. Nabel. Isaacs frowned. Nabel? What does he have to do with this? He's one of the people infected, sir. What? Isaacs yelled the word loudly enough that Jamie feared it would blow out the speakers on her laptop. The connection was spotty, so the camera provided Isaac's face refreshed only every second and a half or so, which meant his expression went from glowering to screaming with his mouth open in an instant. Jamie had to suppress the urge to giggle. Isaacs continued. Nabel was tested before we put him on the bridge, with, I might add, his own foolproof test. It wasn't foolproof, sir. Sometimes it gave false negatives, but not false positives, so how? My guess, sir, is that he got it while he was on the bridge. That's not possible. The virus wasn't airborne yet, and we don't know that, sir, Jamie said emphatically. We don't know the precise vector of the virus because we abandoned Raccoon City before we could track it properly. We don't know how long it incubates, how quickly it became airborne, or gets into the ground. We're spitting in the wind, sir. All right, Isaac said with a distressingly long pause. Your primary purpose there remains the same. Stop the spread of the virus by whatever means are necessary. Yes, I know. I was standing right there next to you when you told me that, Jamie said angrily. Unfortunately, I don't know that I can. Why not? Isaac said angrily. You've been granted executive authority over this by the order of the governor. Yeah, and that went over real well, she winced, recalling the confused, angry, and hurtful, but mostly angry, looks from her fellow doctors when she handed the governor's order over. She'd overheard Dr. Bosquet, one of the locals, refer to her as some private sector diva with pull. How it goes over is comparatively irrelevant, Doctor. The problem is, one of the CDC doctors is making the connection to what happened in Raccoon. That's impossible. Sir, the dead are walking. I think we seriously need to revise our notions of what constitutes impossible. Oh, you have no idea, Doctor, but that's neither here nor there. How can one of those doctors connect this to Raccoon City? Jamie shuddered in her hazmat suit. She'd heard rumors about Project Nemesis and Project Alice, and the odd bioengineering that Isaac's office had been spearheading. She downloaded Valentine and Oliveira's video. That's not possible. We had that removed from the site that was hosting it, and we're trying to trace the uploader now. We also confiscated all the copies. Well, however long it was before you took it down was long enough for some people to see it. Dr. Yuchin has it on her hard drive, and she's noticing that the people we have restrained look just like the people on the video. Not everyone believed the meltdown story, you know. The ravings of conspiracy theorists are not to be taken seriously, Doctor. Dr. Yuchin isn't a conspiracy theorist. She's an intelligent woman with a medical degree who recognizes parallel symptoms when she sees them. Also, she hesitated. This was the main reason she had come into the umbrella tent to contact Isaacs, and she'd been dreading it. Isaacs obviously noticed the hesitation. "What is it, Doctor?" "I've managed to hold them off from sending the test results outside the quarantine area, but I don't know how much longer I can do that." "You can do that as long as you like, Doctor. You're in charge. I can wave the governor's signature around all I want, but I don't think I can push it too far before they start ignoring me, and the cops are on the side of the locals." "That's ridiculous." "Not really, sir. These are the same doctors the cops see in the ER all the time. They know each other. They trust each other. And cops don't trust private sector divas like me. We cannot risk infected blood leaving the quarantine area," Isaacs said, stating the obvious. Jamie already knew that. What she needed was instruction on how to stop that from happening. After a moment's thought, Isaacs said, "Obviously we must contain this situation, Dr. Sirota. Use your authority granted by the governor of California and order all the blood samples destroyed, the patients terminated, and their bodies burned. There must be no evidence left." "Not even for testing?" "There's nothing to test," Isaac said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "We know that this is the result of the T-virus." "Oh, fine. Can I tell Dr. Yuchin and the others that?" "Of course not." "Fine. When they ask why there's nothing to be tested, what do I tell them?" Still impatient, Isaac said, "Tell them it's classified by the order of the governor." "And what happens when they call the governor's office and ask him?" "He'll say exactly what we've instructed him to say. How do you think he got re-elected?" All of a sudden, Jamie's nose started to itch. She tried to ignore it. "Oh, and if you can degauze this, Dr. Yuchin's hard drive, that wouldn't be untoward either." Jamie shook her head. "I'll try my best, but I don't think this is going to work." "Why not?" "Because this might not be an isolated incident. If it is, great. We incinerate the blood and the bodies and we're fine. But this isn't the only place Nabel was after he left Raccoon. True, he didn't break out with symptoms and die, but Jamie found that she couldn't add that part for some reason. Until he got here. But we're not even sure how he was infected, or if it really was him, or if he's the only one. We can't keep this to ourselves, sir. If we let the CDC in on this, then we can—" "No." "Sir, I said no, Dr. Sirota. If you persist in this, you will be recalled and we'll send someone who can do the job properly." Isaacs didn't bother with the rest of the threat. She'd be fired and would never be able to work in her chosen field again, as Umbrella would blackball her. "Yes, sir, I'll—" Before she could finish the sentence, a loud crashing sound came from outside the tent. "What is it?" "I don't know." Jamie walked over to the tent flap and pulled it back, to reveal 3 infected corpses shuffling down the street, where they'd set up their command post, and several hazmat-suited personnel, trying and failing to restrain them. One of the corpses was Jim Nabel. Jamie's heart leapt into her throat. Jim was a good guy, and a brilliant one. He'd done amazing work in the streamlining of blood testing procedures, which, in the age of high-tech crime labs, not to mention rampant disease and drug testing, had made him a very rich man at a very young age. But he'd never let it get to his head. He deserved better than this, especially since his last act in Raccoon City was trying to help people get out. Dr. Yuchin was running down the street. "They got loose! We've got to restrain them!" 2 of the uniforms from the SFPD, who were also wearing hazmat suits, came running, weapons out. "Police! Freeze!" One of the corpses grabbed a hazmat-suited doctor. After a second, Jamie realized it was Bousquet. the one who called her a diva, and bit through the suit. The doctor screamed. "I said freeze!" one of the uniforms yelled. Both had their pistols aimed at the scene. Jamie appreciated their dedication to the letter of the law, but now was not the time. "They won't respond. You need to shoot them in the head," one of the cops said. "This may not be the best time to tell you my range scores." The other cop just fired, hitting one of the corpses in the leg. "That won't do it. The only way to harm them is to shoot them in the brain or sever the spinal cord. That'll short out the impulses the virus is sending to their brains, and they'll die for real." "The hell? You saying they're dead?" Yu Chin shot her a look. "How the hell do you know all that?" "Not now," Jamie said. "Then soon, Doctor." The cops continued to shoot. One managed to get in a headshot, but the other two corpses, including Jim, kept shambling forward. One shot flew wild and hit Bousquet. A moment later, he got up and started shuffling forward too. "Oh my God," Yu Chin said, her pale face growing more ashen behind the hazmat visor. Jamie ran back into the tent. "What's happening?" Isaacs asked. 3 of the subjects got loose. She was looking for and then eventually found her 9mm pistol. Jamie Sirota probably had better range scores than that cop did. Her father had taken her hunting as a kid, along with her 2 brothers, and she was the only one who ever got anything. A fact that always pissed off her older brothers, but made her dad proud. Her entering medical school had been more of a disappointment, but her salary paid for his new house in Florida after he retired, so he didn't complain all that much. "Doctor, you need to." Uninterested in what Isaacs thought she needed to do, Jamie exited the tent just as Jim and the other corpse overwhelmed the 2 cops. Jamie took aim and shot one of them in the head. Jim was feeding on one of the cops, and the officer's flailing spoiled Jamie's shot. A scream from behind her got her attention. Whirling around, she saw 2 more corpses coming down the street, and also that Bousquet was feeding on Yu Chin. She shot Bousquet in the head, the 9mm bullet easily plowing through the hazmat gear, then did the same for the other 2. Then, after hesitating for only a second, she shot Yu Chin in the head too. The bullet was slowed only a bit by the faceplate, which was stronger than the rest of the headgear. True, she wasn't dead yet, but it was only a matter of time. And Isaacs had wanted her out of the way, and this worked too. Cold-blooded, perhaps, but it wasn't as if Yu Chin had a chance in hell now. 3 more corpses were coming down the street. Jamie figured that they'd been tugging against the restraints for more than a day now. They didn't tire. They just kept pushing. And sooner or later, even the strongest material gives in, if pressure is applied long enough. Then a hand touched Jamie's protected shoulder, and she whirled around, trying to raise the pistol once more, but the corpse of Jim Nabel was already on top of her, his mouth craning open. Jamie tried to push him off, but Jim was a lot bigger than she, and he was literally dead weight. They both collapsed to the ground. Pain cut through her right shoulder as Jim bit down on it, his teeth easily ripping through the hazmat suit. Jamie imagined she could feel his infected saliva intermixing with her blood. She kicked upward with her left foot, which got Jim off her. Clambering to her feet, she held up the pistol, supporting it with her left hand, pain slicing through her wounded shoulder, and she shot Jim in the head. Then she turned around and tried to shoot the others, but she couldn't hold up her arm any longer. "Damn it!" She stumbled back into the tent. "Sir, we've lost containment. What happened to... Sir, the infected corpses have broken free. I've stopped some of them, but there are others that I've been unable to terminate, and I've been infected, so it's only a matter of time before I join them." "Dr. Sirota, I need you to..." "Sir, there's nothing I can do for you now. I've reported the breach, and that's the last duty I can perform for the Umbrella Corporation." With her left hand, her right was now pretty much useless. She undid the fastenings on her hazmat suit's headpiece and removed it. I'm sorry I couldn't get the job done, sir. Then she put the pistol's muzzle under her chin and pulled the trigger. Chapter 8. After. Sam Isaacs mostly blamed Timothy Kane. He was a handy scapegoat, the deceased major. For starters, he was deceased. It was always preferable to have someone to blame who was unable to defend himself. Not that Kane would have been able to mount much of a defense. Kane had reopened the hive, violating every protocol the company had, not to mention simple common sense, just to satisfy his own curiosity. Pretty much everything that had happened since could be traced to that event. If the hive had remained sealed, Raccoon City wouldn't have been infected, and it wouldn't have had to be purified. The larger the infected area, the more difficult containment became. That was elementary mathematics. After all, Raccoon City proved too much as the infection got out, presumably through Jim Nabel. And San Francisco, a major city located on a peninsula, was far more difficult to contain than a smaller city located on an island. In fact, it was impossible. The media had painted that California city as ground zero of the infection. But Isaacs knew better. Not that it mattered now. As he went up the hydraulic lift with two of the security people, DeGennaro and Humberg, he thought about how much easier things would have been if Kane wasn't such an idiot. He could have done the Nemesis tests on Addison and Abernathy in relative peace, instead of having them dropped into the infested Raccoon City to engage in some kind of boxing match again for no other reason than to satisfy Kane's own curiosity. Not that he had any kind of scientific interest. Kane's was the same morbid curiosity exhibited by a child who pulled the wings off flies. Isaacs walked toward the mesh fence at the perimeter. He wasn't sure entirely why the undead all congregated here, but there were certainly a lot of them. Hundreds, it seemed. They carried the stench of rotting flesh, overripe fruit, and moldy dust. It was almost as if they saw that there was a fence there, and that meant there was flesh they could feed on. Certainly this facility was the only place in the vicinity where there was human life. Hundreds of dead shuffled forward, slamming into the fence, pushing harder and harder against it, trying and failing to get through. The ones closest to the fence had been slammed against it so many times they barely had faces left. One person's head was little more than a cracked skull with two eye sockets dangling in front, thinly attached by fraying optic nerves. Their hands also were pounded to mulch, trying and failing to plow through to where the living were so they could feed on them. How did they know, though? That was one of many mysteries, but it was one that pointed to a possible conclusion. There was more to these walking corpses than simple electrical impulses being fed to the brain in lieu of blood. Plus, there were the dogs. While humans were barely able to walk in this state, canines appeared to be fully functional. They could run and jump and do pretty much everything they could do when they were alive, yet they were not alive. Given that they could neither respirate nor procreate, still they functioned far better than their human brethren, and among the many tasks Isaac had set about to accomplish was to find out why. And now there was some evidence to show that there was at least a rudimentary intelligence to go with the instincts. The undead had all congregated here, even though there was no evidence that there was life here except for the occasional person who came up the lift. The T-virus that the late Dr. Ashford had developed might have been able to cure far more than a degenerative nerve condition. The bad news was that more tests needed to be run. The good news was that he had an infinite supply of test subjects right outside the fence. To DeGennaro and Humberg, he said, "We need a fresh one. Prepare the tower." "Okie dokie," Gennaro said. "Can you really call someone who's dead fresh?" Humberg asked. DeGennaro smirked. Long as none of 'em grab my ass. Isaacs had long since lamented the possibility of maintaining discipline. Inappropriate humor was the way his people got through the day. Most of those headquartered here and still working for the Umbrella Corporation had lost most of what they had held dear to the T-Virus. They continued to work here not for money. That was a useless commodity now, but for survival. They continued to do their jobs, and Umbrella provided them with food and shelter. But the fact that most of the world's population had succumbed to the T-Virus was of very little moment to Sam Isaacs. He had his research, he had his resources, and he had a problem to solve, so he was content. Most of humanity was dead, but Isaacs had never cared much for most of humanity, made up as it was of dolts and dunderheads who got in the way of allowing Isaacs to do his work. Thanks to the Umbrella Corporation, Isaacs had lost nothing when the world ended. He still had his research, and he was content with that. Isaacs turned away from the Undead and followed DeGennaro and Humberg to the guard tower on the other side of the weather station. The scent of lime wafted across his nostrils, which, oddly, was a palliative after being so close to the Undead. But he didn't even look at the pit where the Alices had been dumped. They represented failure, and while Isaacs was a firm believer in learning from failure, these corpses had gone beyond the point where anything could be learned from them. Besides, he was getting well and truly sick of the sight of that face. If only he'd been able to keep her in Detroit. He entered the guard tower, where another hydraulic lift took him, DeGennaro, and Humberg, up 15 stories. Upon arrival at the top, Isaac stepped into the basket. It was akin to those used on hot air balloons, except that this one was attached to an extendable metal bar, similar to those used by firefighters. DeGennaro said to the guard at the top, "How's life treating you up here in the nosebleed seats, Robertson?" "Just peachy, Deej. It's nice and toasty warm up here. Heat rises, you know." Humberg and DeGennaro followed Isaacs into the basket. At a nod from Isaacs, Robertson activated the bar, which cantilevered out over the mesh fence and above the Undead. This activity was far from covert, as the metal made a horrible noise when it moved. Keeping the hinges oiled wasn't a priority, as oil was needed for far more critical purposes in these dark times. And so, all the Undead looked up at the sound. They started jumping up, grabbing and clawing at the underside of the basket, sensing that there was fresh flesh for them to consume. Robertson, however, kept them above the fray. Since the project required a particularly strong specimen, Isaacs ruled out the women he saw. While he had known plenty of women who could hold their own in a physical conflict, up to and including Alice Abernathy, even before Isaacs got to experiment on her. When one was looking for a sample of humanity with the brute strength Isaacs required, the male of the species was far better suited. He looked down, and eventually his eyes caught a particularly fine one. In part, he stood out because of the brightly colored hockey shirt he wore, with a number emblazoned on the back. It was impossible to tell at the stage of decay the clothes were in, whether or not it was a legitimate hockey uniform or simply a store-bought facsimile. But what mattered to Isaacs was the broadness of the man's shoulders. Pointing at the man in question, he said, "There, that one at the back. He'll do." DeGennaro nodded, and he and Humberg pulled out their carbon fiber nooses. The former whipped the noose around his head with a goofy grin on his face. Humberg rolled his eyes. "John Wayne, you ain't." "Yeah, but that guy's dead and I'm alive." "Big deal, dead. He's still more of a man than you." They threw the nooses down onto Hockey Jersey, each nabbing an arm. It was easy enough to accomplish, as he, along with all the other Undead, reached upward, trying in vain to grab the basket. Both security men pulled, hauling the Undead up, even as Robertson moved the metal arm back toward the tower. Grinning ear to ear, DeGennaro said, "Ride him, cow zombie. Who's John Wayne now?" Isaacs held in a sigh. It didn't do to antagonize those tasked with keeping Isaacs and the others safe. Thus far, Umbrella had been able to buy their loyalty with its stores of foodstuffs, but there was always the chance that the best armed employees might take it upon themselves to take over, and since they had the guns, and knew how to use them, they stood quite an excellent chance of succeeding. If they got the notion into their heads. One sure way to make that happen was to antagonize them, by, say, complaining about their endless half-witticisms. Isaacs, however, was no fool. He let them carry on. Besides, he was going to need them for his long-term plans. One of history's finest lessons was that the strongest emperors were the ones with the most powerful armies. Upon their return to the top of the guard tower, Robertson had the shackles ready. The large metal bar covered the occupant from neck to knee, and was more effective than any straitjacket. They had disabled the function that shot a blast of electricity into the subject if he moved, simply because it was a waste of energy with the undead. The electricity wouldn't slow them down. In fact, there was some evidence to suggest that it would make them more active. Humberg and De Janeiro held the undead in place while Robertson applied the restraints. "This guy smells like ass, like dead ass. Any chance we can take him for a shower first?" Humberg asked. "Go right ahead," De Janeiro said. "I assume you're volunteering to scrub those hard-to-reach areas?" "Blow me." "Later, if you're good." They rode back down to ground level, then took the lift in the weather station back into the complex. Isaacs closed his eyes as they descended, enjoying the feeling of the air conditioning wafting over him. He had never cared much for desert air, particularly when it was perfumed by the aroma of decaying corpses. As soon as he got to the bottom, he saw Slater. This time he didn't bother to hold in the sigh. Alexander Slater's post as second-in-command of Umbrella's Science Division was most assuredly not Isaac's idea. However, there were fewer places to assign people these days, and Slater was qualified to be Isaac's right hand. Most of his staff from San Francisco and Detroit had died, and he couldn't afford to be choosy, nor could he afford to complain to the committee about Slater's appointment. At least not yet. And while he had no choice but to acquiesce to Slater's placement, Isaac certainly had no reason to treat him with anything other than contempt. "We're late," Slater said, without preamble. "I'm sorry?" "The committee meeting started 5 minutes ago. Where the hell have you been?" Ignoring the question, Isaacs turned to De Janeiro. "Put that in my lab. You know the drill." "You betcha, boss man." De Janeiro turned to Hockey Jersey. "Come on, Gretzky. Let's stick you in the goal." Isaacs turned and walked toward the meeting room, not bothering to see if Slater followed. Reaching into his lab coat pocket, he touched the button on a device held therein. As he approached the room, Isaacs could hear the conversation from down the corridor. The French accent and nasal tone indicated that Jacques Mercier, the head of the French division, was giving the report. "Ultis, biohazard numbers increasing." A moment later, the clipped British tones of the head of the United Kingdom division, Colin Wainwright, could be heard. "London facility. Food supplies down to 28%. 17 casualties. Biohazard numbers increasing." Isaacs entered just as Chairman Wesker's authoritative voice could be heard. "Thank you for your reports." Upon entering the large room, Isaac saw a large, dark table in the center of the dimly lit space. A holographic representation of the globe rotated over the tabletop, with the hexagonal Umbrella logo indicating the location of Umbrella's headquarters on 5 continents. On the far wall, several screens showed footage of cities around the globe: London, Paris, Lisboa, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, Antananarivo, Srinagar, Tokyo, Beijing, Berlin, Moscova, Johannesburg, New Delhi. All of them were being overrun by the undead in much the same way Raccoon City and San Francisco had been years ago. As ever, Isaac blamed Kane. "Gentlemen," he said as he walked in, heads all turned. Or rather, the illusion of heads, while Isaac saw the faces of all 8 of Umbrella's division heads as well as that of Chairman Wesker, he knew that none of them was actually in the room. Every Umbrella facility had a meeting room just like this one, and they were all showing the same information on the holograph above the table and on the screens on the wall. They also all appeared to have the same 8 people sitting around the table, and they all saw an image of Isaacs and Slater walking into the room. The holography department had done its work well. Travel was too risky these days, and while it was difficult to coordinate a meeting that would occur across assorted time zones, that was preferable to risking the lives of the corporation's most important people. Wesker looked over at Isaacs. At least Isaacs assumed he did. It was hard to tell, as the chairman insisted on wearing mirror shades at all times. Wesker still wore the same crew cut he'd affected as a Marine. He still had multiple scars from that time, and Isaacs wondered if he wore the shades because of some ocular affliction, or if he was just a pretentious ass. If there were still money in the world, Isaacs would have bet all of it on the latter. "How good of the science division to join us," Wesker said dryly. Isaacs heard Slater exhale through his teeth, but he ignored it as he ignored most of what came out of Slater's mouth. He simply said, "I have been busy." Wesker lowered his shades and stared at Isaacs with a penetrating pair of eyes, leading Isaacs to understand a bit more why he wore them. "That's most interesting, Doctor, because we were just about to discuss the results of your experiments, or rather, the lack of them." "Is that so?" Isaacs asked. For lack of anything better to say, he'd been expecting something like this, which was why he hadn't been eager to show up on time for the meeting in the first place. Wainwright spoke next. "On the subject of the biohazard, what does the science division have to report?" Not for the first time, Isaacs marveled at his employer's capacity for making the appalling sound commonplace, though he wondered who precisely they were trying to impress at this point. Biohazard sounded as if someone had been putting anthrax through the postal system, or a flu strain was going around. The T-virus was several orders of magnitude worse than a biohazard. But then, Wainwright had a much bigger population of living humans left to be concerned with. Europe and Asia were still comparatively well off, while the Americas, Africa, and Australia had been almost completely overrun. The spread of the T-virus had been slower in the other 2 continents. Wainwright and the other Eurasian division heads no doubt harbored some illusion that they could beat this back. Unfortunately, Isaacs was not about to give them the answers they wanted. "We now know conclusively that they have no real need for sustenance. They hunger for flesh, but do not require it." A rumble of discontent went through the room. The one benefit to the undead so greatly outnumbering the living was the hope that with a shortage of flesh to feed off, the undead would simply die out on their own. Isaacs had said all along that this was unlikely. After all, what use did the undead have for nourishment? But the committee had clung to the possibility as if it were a life preserver. Isaacs went on, "Unless exposed to extremes of temperature or environment," or he didn't bother to add all shot in the head, "my research indicates that they would remain active for decades." Wainwright stood up at that, pounding his fist on the table as he rose. "Decades? We had to be trapped underground for decades?" Wesker raised his hand and stared at Wainwright, whose face contorted into a more meek expression, and he sat back down. "What news of Project Alice?" Here, Isaacs knew he could provide that life preserver. "Our goals remain unchanged. The original Project Alice was unique. She bonded with the T-virus on a cellular level, somehow managing to overcome it, using antibodies from her blood. The one aspect of Alice he'd been able to hang on to after the disaster in Detroit. I will develop a serum that will not just combat the effects of T-virus, but potentially reverse it." Isaac started to pace around the table, being sure to make eye contact with each committee member as he spoke. The power of this serum would go far beyond the weak antivirus we have now. For those not yet infected, the serum would offer complete immunity, and for the— he hesitated, then looked right at Wainwright— biohazard themselves, a partial reversal of the process, giving back these creatures a measure of their intelligence, their memories, and curbing their hunger for flesh. The ripple that went through the committee this time was far more positive. Wesker asked, "You're confident you can domesticate them?" In fact, Isaacs was confident of no such thing. That was the goal, yes, but there were many roadblocks. However, appearances needed to be maintained. "Why not?" he said matter-of-factly. "They are animals, essentially. We can train them, if we can take away their baser instincts." Behind him, Isaacs heard Slater mutter, "And if my grandmother had wheels, she'd be a wagon." Slater had been against this entire program from the start, viewing it as a waste of time. "Sure," he had said once, "if you can take away their baser instincts, but it's not like that's something you can just carve out of their brains. In fact, you try that, you lose them." Isaacs, however, was more sanguine. To the committee, he continued, "They'll never be human again, but would provide the basis for a docile workforce under our guidance. We would return to the surface and create a new world order in our image." Some of the committee members seemed to like the sound of that. Mercier, however, was not one of them. "Pipe dreams," the Frenchman said, flicking his hand in a scoffing motion. "After months of experiments, you have nothing to show, and we are left to rot underground." "Without the original Project Alice," Isaac said testily, "progress has been difficult. We have been forced to try and replicate her using cloned genetic models whose growth has been accelerated by Dr. Wiegand. It's laborious, and the results are unpredictable." Wainwright snorted, 85 failures, Doctor." Shrugging, Isaac said, "This is not an exact science." "I don't see much science at all." Before Isaacs could reply to the slander, as if this idiot bureaucrat knew anything about science in the first place, Wesker again held up a hand. "Project Alice and the subject of domestication is of the highest priority." Then suddenly the image of Wesker froze for a second, his face in a comical position for half a second, before he went on, the signal having been reacquired, his gaze now suddenly fixed firmly on Isaac's. "You will concentrate on this to the exclusion of all other research. We will expect an updated report within the week." For about the 9,000th time, Isaac said, "Simply demanding results will not guarantee them." This was something else he blamed Kane for. He always blithely gave timetables for accomplishments that had no bearing on reality, but were fast enough to suit the whims of the committee. Science didn't actually work like that. However, it seemed that Isaacs had used up whatever reassurances he could provide, because this was the first time that Wesker responded to his rational explanations with a threat. "Then perhaps we should place someone else in charge. Someone—" Again Wesker's signal was interrupted, then it picked up again, but the audio was now out of sync with his mouth. "Someone who can give us the reassurances we require." Wesker looked like one of those badly dubbed martial arts films that the security staff seemed to get no end of enjoyment in watching over and over again during their downtime. Suddenly, Isaacs was very much aware of Slater standing behind him. Slater was just stupid enough to tell the committee what they wanted to hear, rather than what they needed to hear. "Continue with your research, Doctor." Wesker's image hadn't yet caught up to his voice. "And be quick about it while it is still your research. This meeting is adjourned." The images of the committee members, as well as the footage on the wall screens and the holograph of the globe, all winked out as one. Were Slater not still in the room, Isaacs would have pointed out, if only to the empty air, that it would be his research no matter who administered it. But he saw no reason to give Slater more ammunition. He had been fairly certain that Slater was making his own reports to the committee. even though technically the only person Slater was supposed to send any reports to was Isaacs himself. Still, that was a problem for another day. Isaacs turned around to see Slater grinning stupidly. That went well. I have work to do, Isaacs said as he strode past Slater. Yeah, you do, and you'd be wise to do it quickly and not piss Wesker off. Continuing to ignore Slater, Isaacs proceeded to his lab. Only when he'd shut the door behind him did he allow himself to speak. Doing an exaggerated impersonation of Wainwright's London accent, he said, I don't see much science at all. Imbeciles. With a glance, he saw that De Janeiro and Humberg had secured hockey jersey to the wall. A collar around his neck and shackles behind his wrists, the undead, or biohazard, to use the committee's preferred euphemism, struggled mightily against those restraints as soon as Isaacs walked into the room. But he ignored the creature as easily as he'd ignored Slater. Isaacs reached into his lab coat pocket and took out the device he'd been running since before walking into the room, a digital recorder. He placed the recorder on the docking station attached to his computer. Using the mouse and keyboard, he instructed the program that ran as soon as he docked the recorder to isolate Wesker's voice print. Continue with your threats, Wesker, Isaacs muttered, while it's still your corporation to run. Hockey jersey pulled harder against his restraints. Isaacs finally looked at him. In due time. Then he turned to look at the lab's far window, and he smiled. Officially, the only two projects that were currently active in this facility were Project Alice and the research into the domestication of the biohazard. Clone 86 was being prepped even now for the former, and hockey jersey was the latest subject to facilitate the latter. But there was a third project that was just as active and even more important than those two as far as Sam Isaacs was concerned. It was only because that project was so much closer to fruition that Isaacs had taken the risk of bringing a digital recorder into the committee meeting. But he would need Wesker's voice to accomplish his goals, and nobody would stand in his way.